Welcome to the next edition of Focused by Ziplet. I'm Ben Barnett, the CEO of Ziplet. Ziplet is a edtech platform that is used to measure, understand, and improve student experience. And we work with tertiary institutions in Australia and also globally in helping them to improve their student experience. I'm very happy today to be joined by Lucy Blakemore, who is a research and insights professional focused in the world of student experience, global education, and digital transformation in education. Lucy leads a lot of work with respect to education and innovation in this space in Australia, principally, and has also had teaching roles abroad in the UK, Italy, Sudan, and Australia. Lucy's background is degrees from Oxford University. She also has a Master's of Education from UTS and is a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy also. So we're very happy to have Lucy join us today, and we'll be exploring various aspects of the student experience, but also Lucy's work as well and how that might help institutions that we work with. So very warm welcome and great to have you here, Lucy.
Thanks, Ben. Happy to be here.
Great. I think it'd be really interesting just to begin with a little bit of your background in terms of what your current role is and also how you ended up in that role.
Yeah, so it depends how far back we want to go, but it's probably useful to start with my first career, which was in the commercial corporate market research space. So back in the UK, I started my graduate life looking at international qualitative research. So I used to work with a really broad variety of sectors, from whiskey to chocolate to healthcare to all kinds of things. Interviewing people, running discussions, workshops, innovation work, and often working across multiple countries. So we used to kind of look at projects where people needed to understand what the differences were between the Brazilians using something and the French using something and the Chinese market using something, pulling it all together for those kind of global strategies. 6 years after that, I moved to Australia and jumped back into a career I'd played with a little bit as a student. When I was in Italy, I used to teach English a little bit. And I started doing that again when I came back, when I came into Australia. And that kind of rolled out the rest of my time up until now. So I moved from teaching into e-learning, as we called it 10 or more years ago. Worked a lot with teachers, kind of being with them in classrooms, trying to understand where the barriers were with technology, kind of learning at the same speeds almost as we still do with technology. And then gradually moved into the broader space of both academic and student experience, originally in the ways that technology plays into that, but increasingly and now kind of the whole gamut of what it means to be a student, not just a school leaver student, but a postgraduate student, a student who's domestic, international, all of that kind of thing. So I've kind of merged over the last 20 years, I've merged all of the bits of my previous careers into what it is now, if that makes sense.
And what does your day-to-day look like now in terms of the clients that you serve in the sector?
Yeah, very different each day, each week, and month to month. I would often be interviewing students, more and more via Zoom now, but that's great because it means that we can get to so many different students in lots of different places. So it depends. Briefs might vary from trying to understand why students are not enrolling in certain courses or why they're enrolling and then dropping out. Trying to understand student decision making is a big one that comes up a lot. So having deep, longer conversations than just a 5 or a 10-minute why are you here and what does it mean to you, trying to understand the deeper contexts and experiences that students are having when they're choosing higher education even. And those are really super interesting conversations to be having during just after COVID and a few years on as mindsets are starting to shift around that point. So student research is a lot of what I do, but then putting that into action. So once you've got findings, whether those are qual or quant, and most of the time I'm working with qual, but of course they have to speak to each other. It's then, well, what do we do with that? How do we bring people into the understanding of those findings? How do we work those into our strategic planning? What do we actually do about it? And so there's a lot of dot connecting that's as much if not more than kind of the research itself.
And when an institution engages you, what's the typical challenge or problem that they're setting with respect to understanding their students?
There probably is no typical, and there can be, there's smaller micro things like, why is this thing not working as we thought it would in this particular course or discipline, through to macro, we just need to understand our student journey better. We know what it looks like on paper, we know what the digital imprints are telling us. Now we need to understand the stories behind why there's a big dip here, or what are our various student persona groups, and how can we upskill our teams across the student journey to work better with those. So it really does vary. There's no typical project.
And if we take a step back and think about the student experience, which I'm sure much of your work has various touch points with, what are your broad reflections in terms of the importance for institutions to get the student experience right in their institution?
Yeah, there's so many things to talk about here. I think it's important for three key audiences. It's important for the student, of course. The students put time, money, effort, often actually deep emotional investment in their own study. It may have been a big decision for them. They may be first in family. They may be continuing decades of family tradition. It's much more of a thing for the individual going through it than I think we see in all of our reports and all of our spreadsheets and that kind of thing. So for them, we talk a lot about ROI and those kind of things. It's not just the monetary ROI that value is coming from. It's education is completely steeped in people's dreams and ambitions for themselves. And so delivering on that in ways that not only meet expectations that are beyond what the student expected are so important. And let me just give one example. I recently interviewed some students who studied 10 or more years ago. Someone had originally come to Australia 20 years ago. And the moments that they remembered and the impact of those moments on their lives were so much about little things like the relationship with a teacher, or something where they were going through a hard time and somebody noticed them as an individual and kind of pulled them through and sometimes changed the course of their life. Somebody said, oh, you should do a master's in that, you'd be really good at that. And I'm like, oh, me? And then, so their life kind of takes turns this way and the other. And that, those things are really hard to capture in our very traditional kind of linear tools. So that, massive value for the student. I think that kind of goes without saying. But for institutions and, once you look bigger, societies and employers and so on, student experience is really important too. If you're an academic and your students are having a bumpy, difficult experience, that impacts your experience. And academics are having bumpy and difficult experiences with technology or systems or those kind of things as well. So you can't just say, student experience is all about making a student happy. It's about how the whole system works effectively to the benefit of everybody. And yeah, I mentioned employers and communities and societies. I think we do hear a lot about that. But eventually, if the system's working well and achieving what it should, then employers are getting people with the right skills. We're bringing people into our communities who have the right skills, and could talk for a long time about that.
And it's an interesting point that you make with respect to individual students, in that higher education is usually a very significant decision in their life. And as you said, the ramifications of what that experience is like for them can be quite large in terms of their life choices. On the other hand, as you said, it's very challenging for institutions with large cohorts and large enrollments to be able to support those students. What have you seen in terms of some of the better approaches to be able to connect with students as individuals, and approaches that you have seen students actually value the most in terms of their student experience?
Yeah, it so often comes down to a human touch. I don't think I've ever heard a student say the systems were so amazing, I'm so impressed by. I mean, sometimes it's implied, right? If they had a smooth application process or something went more smoothly than expected, but it's hard for them to talk about an amazing process, because when it works really well, the friction points are low, and you kind of, you don't get the glory for minimizing friction points, but it makes all the difference. The stories that they do tell are when they felt noticed, when they felt they were listened to, when their feedback was taken on board and something was done about it. And where, again, particularly if they were at a difficult point, they were having a pain point, with international students, it can be all kinds of things from visas to not understanding systems and so on. For domestic students, equally, a bunch of different challenges in not understanding how something works, or maybe something goes wrong in their personal life and their studies affected. But the response, how we deal with those unexpected things, really makes a big difference to how students experience their education.
And in many respects, does part of delivering a good student experience mean also avoiding a bad student experience, to the point that you mentioned there that some of the things that are more memorable actually is when the system falls down, the system doesn't work? Do you have any thoughts in terms of how avoiding a bad student experience is also an important part of the delivery for students as well?
Yeah, and when I was talking before, I was thinking it's often like the IT systems, it's the unsung. When everything's right, nobody gives any praise to the IT department, because everything's working as it should be. And then when it goes wrong, there's blame echoes everywhere. But there are actually, on a serious point, there are serious ramifications to difficult digital experiences, for example, where a student can't log in or is going around an endless loop of a system sending you to the same place and then back to the wrong place and so on. Depending on where the student's at, if they're trying to apply for something, assignment deadlines are a typical one. Most students can remember a time where maybe they pushed it a bit close to the deadline and then something in the system let them down, and they couldn't submit the assignment. Or, it's often those high pressure moments where again, coming back to the international student context, I've had so many students tell me that the most stressful times of their lives were filling out forms and the bureaucracy. And we're actually really quite terrible for that in higher education. We're full of bureaucracy and forms and our own systems. And that's where a lot of the pain points come, when students have come either from high schools or from other countries, or postgrad students with full of life experiences have told me, I know I'm an intelligent person, and yet I could not figure out how to submit my essay or put this form in or do this. And, if we're making students feel stupid for doing what should be quite simple things, then obviously that's not an ideal experience.
And you've touched on various groupings in terms of working through the discussion so far, various groupings of students. Obviously, the diversity of the student body has changed quite dramatically over the last 20 or 30 years. There are new groups entering higher education. Internationalization has driven that as well. Through your work, how have you engaged with diversity in terms of different backgrounds of students, and how do you think institutions are dealing with those diverse backgrounds as well?
Yeah. Well, as a qualitative specialist, my job is to listen. And so I find that the best way in not dealing with diversity, but understanding diversity, is creating spaces where you can welcome that in and listen for it, even if you weren't looking for it, actually. So, diversity goes in so many different directions. And I started to notice a couple of years ago that we'd be in a conversation and a student would be like, just drop in, oh, because I've got ADHD, I find X, Y, and Z difficult. And they might be a 42-year-old postgrad student who's restarting study, and they've had a diagnosis of something, and it wasn't the reason we were talking to them, but it was actually a really important factor in the course they chose, the institution they chose, their understanding of what makes good study habits and what would be good for them as an individual. So that was a real moment for me that was like, okay, I understand we didn't recruit for this, but it's important to make space for bringing that in. And I think that's one of the frustrating things about the quantitative side of research. And it's not just about qual versus quant, it's a much broader thing. But you don't get to kind of go more than a couple of layers deep to understand what was behind that dissatisfaction score. And it might be because they're neurodiverse, or because their first language isn't English, or because they're still pretty new to the whole higher education system, or they dropped out of school and came back in their 30s, and what's all this weird language that they're having to deal with. I think for institutions dealing with diversity, I think there's a lot happening in terms of things like awareness of accessibility. In the technical space, there are increasingly teams who are skilled and upskilling themselves in ensuring that learning experiences are accessible, both in the technical sense, captions and making sure that images are alt texted and those kind of things, but also trying to expand that conversation into what can learning look like to be truly equitable for different groups of students. So there are pockets of excellence. I think across the board, it's still far too tempting to go, okay, where's the majority? How do we tailor to that? How do we cater to that? And forgetting that the edge cases are actually where a lot of the innovation comes from. And if you look to the edge cases, then you can actually design for everybody, and nobody loses out.
And is that because the educators are on the front line, so to speak, and have the sort of primary touch points with their students?
I think these kind of insights can come from lots of different places. I think those who are teaching day to day see one element of it. I don't think they see everything. And I have my own insight into this actually when I interviewed one of my own former students recently, who I'd taught, and I thought I knew. And it was only when I spoke to her recently that I understood all of this context around what her experience had been at that time, that even being, she was in a class of 15 students with me, and I thought I knew her quite well, but we just hadn't had the space to have that broader conversation about what the pressures were or what she was enjoying and so on. So absolutely, educators can be sources of insight and should be part of all of these student experience conversations. But apart from that, there are so many different ways for us to understand the diversity of student experience. And of course, talking to students themselves has to be part of it the whole time, and ongoing, beyond a survey dip or, a big project that has, big findings, and then we put it in a drawer and move on. It has to be a continuous part of how we do things. And yeah, I could talk for hours about that as well. How we need to get better at asking questions, at designing conversations that we can learn things from, and so on.
So why don't we explore that concept of continuity? I think in many ways, the sector is aware of student experience, and as you said, quite often big projects are stood up, but the extent to which those big projects can turn into continuous, ongoing interactions where there's lots of learning and lots of change over time, that can often be an organizational challenge. What are your views in terms of what institutions can be doing better to continue, I guess, a continuing concern with student experience and that learning process? Where do you see the opportunities?
Lots of different spaces. I guess initially, strategy and research have to talk to each other. They have to be in dialogue, and they're not always, maybe not even often. So there's a strategy over here, and then there might be some research and some other things over here. But if the strategy isn't using research as a informing factor to understand whether it's the right kind of strategy, but equally, if when we're running research, it's not informed by strategy, you can run the best research project ever with the most beautiful methodology and the most interesting findings. But if your institutional strategy is headed that way and your research is showing you that, then nobody will ever see the value in both. So I think in having a continuous impact, it's much more about flexibility and adaptability and a mindset that is starting to tune into the value of these things. So making sure that when you're generating insights about student experience, that it's transparent and it's being shared and it's being discussed. So it's not a paper that's put in front of somebody and said, here's our insights, off you hop. You running workshops and conversations and saying, well, how does this sit with you? Does it resonate with you? is it right? If it's not, why not? Where is it bumping up against our assumptions? That's where the interesting stuff really happens. I think some of the most rewarding parts of my work have, yes, been when you do a great project and you feel like you've uncovered an aspect of something that's a bit unique, but even more so when you take it into a group of people who are on the front lines, as you say, in different roles, whether it's student counselling or teaching or running a campus, and you share it back and they sit back and they go, that's my work right there. And nobody's ever explained it back in that way. Nobody's ever shown us the bigger picture of how the student experience fits into that. And that's really powerful. Again, those things can happen once and then you leave it behind and you go, it's all right, we've done the student experience strategy now. But it takes a kind of a dogged determination to keep pulling out those pieces of research and those insights and say, do we still believe this? Yes or no? If not, what else do we need to find out? So it's as much a mindset and a culture of being research informed. I think our universities probably feel like they are because research is at the heart of what universities do, but it's very different, running a series of bits of research versus having it at the cultural heart of what you do and feeding into your everyday.
And does that mean in many ways that institutions need to have culturally student experience always at the front of their mind, in that, and almost all roles within a higher education institution need to be continually referring back to the student experience and at least having a mental acknowledgement that student experience is part of my role and I have to continually be thinking about that? Is that the sort of cultural transformation that I think institutions need to move to?
I think so. I think everybody from the furthest person away who's doing IT support or cleaning the toilets, I don't know. The cliche is like when Kennedy was putting a man on the moon, even the person mopping the floor of the toilets knew that they were helping get someone to the moon, right? It's a horrible cliche, but I think if you know why you're doing what you're doing and it's connected to something meaningful, which, as we said right at the start of this, is changing somebody's life, helping them, reach their ambition or, contributing to a country's skill set and so on, then it reminds us why we're all here. And it always makes me laugh that universities, they sit in the same spaces as their students. They're quite different from, a pharmaceutical sector or a chocolate maker or something like that, where you have to go out and find your customers in the wild and pounce on them and, ask them about their experience. For universities and other tertiary institutions, your customers, your students are there the whole time. They're in and around your buildings. They're in your digital systems, leaving digital footprints and they're on the front lines with your teachers. And I just don't think we make enough of that. You could do ethnography every single day, sitting in key areas of your university, observing what people are doing and asking them what they're doing. And it's such a missed opportunity, actually.
And in many ways, as you said at the outset, it's a much more important life moment for students than consumption choices they might be making on a day-to-day basis is actually a significant part of their life. So getting it right actually matters for them in a really important way. If we, and I know this could take us in a variety of ways, but if you think about your work in recent times and you think about the opportunities to improve student experience, where do you see the big opportunities for higher education institutions?
Gosh, that is a big question. I mean, there's immediate challenges, and then there's kind of the longer term things that come back again and again. And there are, I hesitate to call mental health a trend because it's not, but there are things that I've heard students talking about more in recent years than they did before. I did research before COVID, and students would talk about mental health and challenges and things like that. In the research I've done since COVID, there's a language and understanding around mental health, and it's being articulated more and more clearly than it was before. And I think that's an example of how there's a much broader ecosystem around learning and student experience than I think our systems and spreadsheets and institutional org charts tell us. That's, I think, where things need to go. It's understanding that, no student is an island, no academic is an island. They sit nested within these complex sets of systems that impact them. And if we don't understand that, if we don't understand what it's like to be first in family and dealing with all these things for the first time, or if we don't understand an academic experience as well and what it's like to have had to teach through COVID, burnout, come back, be asked to innovate again, now being asked to get your head around AI and all those kind of things. If we don't understand what those experiences are like and where they sit, then we can't respond to them with our, we can have the best products in the world, but it's just, your solutions are here and the people in their lives are here. So my instinct is that allowing ourselves to be more immersed in the complexity of student experience and academic experience, and not asking everything to fit into our institutional boxes, which I still think we do, is going to have to be the way forward.
And in many ways, that speaks to the transformation that higher education institutions almost need to work through. The model 30, 40 years ago was a particular type of student, and the engagement between the institution and the student was very much academic, teaching and learning based. The rest of your life was a separate concern. And we've seen new groups enter the higher education system. And then, as you said, COVID has really accelerated some of the complexity that was probably already there, but has made it a bit more visible. How do you think institutions can go about this transformation? How can they be setting themselves up for success from a strategic perspective to begin to address some of these challenges?
Another huge question. I think it starts by understanding the baseline. I think if you don't already have a solid research-informed anchor point as to where things are at the moment, then you can't start to build on it. And it'll be different for every institution. If you're a small institution in a rural area and catering to a certain audience, then your priorities for student experience will be very different than if you're a 40,000 seat metropolitan university with the cohorts that you've got. And so I think it's everything to its own context, but it has to start with understanding who are your students, what are the contexts around where they sit, and then understanding and asking the hard questions about your own institution as well. People sometimes start with their own institution and then they get stuck there. It's like, here's how we do our things and let's design our things around this shape. Very, very common. But having the courage to question, well, okay, things have worked this way for 30 or 40 years. Does that mean they have to continue working in this way? Someone once joked that we've had the same job titles in universities for the last 1,000 years. Now that's, one way of looking at it, but I think being prepared to challenge the many legacies. There are so many legacies and there's so much tradition and there's so much positive affection, but also clinging on to the way that things are done, that I think unless we're prepared to kind of pull them apart and put them back together again, it's difficult to transform. And it's about culture, it's about mindset, even if you've got the best technical systems in the world.
And in many ways, institutions have been established with themselves at the centre, and it seems the trend will emerge where students are at the centre, which means a lot of the systems and the legacy approaches will have to evolve to have students at the centre. Have you identified any success stories in this particular space where it's been particular institutions or particular interventions that institutions have been able to make that have helped them on that journey to being more student focused?
Do you know, I think the success stories are hard to tell because it's often little tiny details here and there. And it's often hard to track sometimes because it's an absence of difficulties rather than a presence of something that's been achieved, for example. But things like making application processes smoother, for example, and making it 2 or 3 clicks for the student to get to the next stage of where they need to in their application and enrollment, rather than 3 or 4 or 5, or having to speak to somebody or that kind of thing. those kind of things, they're really boring and mundane, but they can make a huge difference to the university, because you can get more students moving along more quickly, but also to the student who doesn't feel like they're suddenly in some weird space where they don't understand anything, and why should they spend any time here and spend tens of thousands of dollars on this strange, bumpy experience. So yeah, it's hard to share kind of hero experiences, but I think it's actually important to look for those little details and where they make the difference. Yeah.
And those little details cumulatively can obviously a large experience.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, there's one of my favorite. I don't often have favorite theories, but my current favorite theory is complexity theory, that says there is no magic button. There's no big lever that you can press that says, it's all about this or it's all about this. And I never trust anybody who says, well, the thing that's making the biggest difference. I mean, yes, we have to prioritize things, but with something as complex as education, and this is why complexity theory and education have started talking to each other more, it's a little bit of everything. It's all of those systems that surround it. It's what the teachers have been through and what they're giving to it. It's the technical side of things. And you kind of can't neglect any of them. It has to be a holistic, full approach where they're all talking to each other. And that's the hardest thing to achieve. Again, it's why mindset is often more important than technology, because if you have a culture where people are sharing things and sharing insights and talking to each other and happy to put ideas out there, then you've got something that's more of I'm doing this with my hands, more of a connected network that's talking to each other in a sensible way than, 2 or 3 star projects that say they're going to solve the challenge.
And I'm guessing that's why the cultural aspect is important, and also the continuity aspect is important, as well as the ongoing listening that facilitates that process, and then cumulatively over time, that experience hopefully improves through those interactions. If you think about your work over recent times, also the COVID moment that we've all experienced in the last couple of years, and where you think student experience is heading, where do you think the student experience will be in 5 years, and what do you hope will be more core to an ideal student experience in that time?
Yeah, so again, firstly, it's got to be different for different institutions. So I think if you ask a small college in a certain area where they should be in 5 years' time, it should and can be very different from where a very large institution catering to the city audience would be in 5 years' time. But I think there probably are themes that connect them. I'm hoping that it will continue to be human first, and that the human first will increasingly have a role, and more than just a lip service, we put students first kind of role. I think it means understanding where technology and digital does and doesn't play, understanding where it can smooth the experience and where it can interrupt, but also remembering the value that the frontline people have, that the teachers have, and again and again, I've heard from students in the experience now, and looking back 10 and 20 years, the people are what made the difference. Whether it was a teacher or a counselor or somebody that just stopped to listen or to suggest something. It might be a micro moment, but the humans did that. It wasn't a piece of technology that suddenly said, hey, have you thought about doing a master's? Because technology can do that, but it tends not to if you're not a typical case. And I think the other thing I would like to see is just generally technology removing barriers rather than being a distraction. I've just actually finished a master's this year myself, and found myself kind of micro analyzing all the points where things weren't as easy as they should be. And I just wanted to focus on the topic of the essay. And yet I was struggling with, 2 or 3 technical things that I've worked in e-learning and technology for a long time, and still it wasn't obvious to me what I was meant to do. So I think we have to keep pushing for technology to be user-centered, and to smooth the way as far as possible, so that students and academics and institutions can focus on what they're there for, which is the learning and moving their own lives forward.
Lucy, what a great note to end on. Very much for a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I enjoyed it too.
Just stop the video here 1 second. Lucy, that was fantastic. That was great. That really went in